Well, what I thought I would do today is just maybe because I'm also a little bit tired already. I mean, this Mises Summer Unity for all people who are watching on the World Wide Web, on TV screens or whatever, on C-SPAN. This is actually work here. It's unbelievable. These guys are laughing, though those who laugh, they had a night of sleep, or the others who are studying very seriously. And yeah, so I'm tired. I'm happy that I can sit. I'm happy that I can maybe just read a couple of passages that might be of some interest for some of you. So I selected a few things from his youth, his difficult start in professional life, and then later on some incidents relating to how Mises encountered American libertarians after he moved to the US. But before I start, let me maybe say one thing that needs to be said again and again. I mean, so you have this genius, and Mises certainly was a genius, who has this brother, Richard von Mises. Who has heard of Richard von Mises? Haha. Who has heard from about Richard von Mises the first time here at the Summer University? Okay, so it's a fair share, but many others as well. Well, I'm very happy to see this. But this shows you only, well, the importance of the Mises family. You just cannot escape them. Okay? I mean, if you thought you were safe by ignoring Austrian economics, no, you get into the claws of Richard. So how is it that two brothers are such extraordinary personalities, both produce great achievements in science, Richard in the natural sciences, applied mathematics in particular, and Ludwig in the social sciences and economics? Well, I mean, this cannot be any accident, okay? So what does this give us to think? Well, naturally we think of their parents, okay? And the main person responsible for the two of them was their mother. Okay, so I mean, certainly Ludwig von Mises would not have been there where he was if it had not been for this lady who took care of him and kicked butts when necessary, probably, right? And and clearly she did an extraordinary job. It was customary at the time that it was an affluent, well, not really very affluent or very rich, but well-off family, so that helpers at home. There was a cook, and they had also a maid. So she didn't have to take care of all the earthly things of cleaning and so on that was being taken care of, but she looked especially after the boys. And we find very many common characteristics in Richard and Ludwig, for example. Well, both were very systematic in their way. Richard, by the way, also wrote a general treatise on science. Okay, he called it a little textbook on economics. So, that's a literal translation. I don't know what the English. Sorry, not on economics. Little textbooks on positivism. Kleines Lehrbuch des Positivismus. I think in English the translation is positivism. So the German title was more moderate, but in fact what he does is to develop a comprehensive system of scientific analysis. He starts with a general theory of language, okay, and then moves up his way from there to the study of our natural environment, so the natural sciences, and then finally covers all other things, arts, the social sciences, and also economics. Okay, so he said some nasty things about libertarians and so on. Yeah. And in Ludwig, of course, it's the same thing. Right? The starting point is very different, doesn't deal much with language and so on. Here we have a praxeological system of thought, but it's the same thing. You write a systematic treatise dealing with the most general phenomena first, and then move up your way to more and more specific things. So both of them obviously were used to, well, being systematic, not just haphazard, well, jump a little here and jump a little there, have a little model there and a little other model there, and don't worry about the contradictions. The tests will reveal it or whatever. They were very thorough, extremely rigorous in their approach, and certainly that's something that must have been inculcated into them at home. Both are very moderate. Now, Ludwig was, of course, famous for his tempers. Okay. So there you see the great progress that Austrian economics has made from him to me, because I'm a charming little German. He was famous for his tempers, but essentially, he got upset with people who were arrogating to themselves authority without knowing anything. So he wouldn't suffer fools gladly, as you say in English. Right? So, I mean, whenever he encountered such a species, I mean, he would just go through the roof and let him feel that, well, what he thought of him. But otherwise, he was never pretentious as far as his own work is concerned. Writing style, there's no jargon there. Always try to state things very, very simply, very clearly, and we find the same thing in Richard. Ludwig would keep all of his life a little diary. Well, he wouldn't confess his love stories in it and so on, but made just observations about whom he met, when and where. And he kept a ledger with his expenses. Okay, so very, very conscientious. So these were, well, then qualities that, well, guided him throughout his life, being systematic and so on. So he made his studies, and then got a doctorate in early 1906 when he was 24 years old. At the time, you didn't have to write a dissertation; you just did a couple of oral exams. But of course, I mean, our oral exam at the end of the week is just, I mean, it's a friendship celebration in comparison to what he had to undergo, right? I mean, so it was really examined on, well, you know what canon law is? Canon law? Anybody raise your hand who knows what canon law is? Well, not bad. Well, I won't examine you now, but so canon law is church law, right? Legal code of the Catholic Church for its internal affairs, and he learned this. And then, of course, also Roman law, and in particular then the Austro-Hungarian law that was built on Roman law later on. So, but that's just the history of law. Right? So there was one little discipline, one little exam, and then you had the other stuff too. So he starts then in 1906, starts his professional career. And I'll just read a little bit about this. Oh yeah, well, I mean, right from the beginning, I mean, he knew that, well, his main interest was not in becoming whatever, a lawyer or a civil servant and so on. His main interest was still in pursuing intellectual work. So in particular, he had very early on decided himself to fill a gap in Austrian economics as it existed in those days, which concerned monetary theory. Theory of money had not yet been covered from the point of view of the general approach to value and price theory that Menger had developed. And so Mises set out to work on this right after his doctorate, probably. But on the other hand, well, he had to earn a living. So he had to pursue both these projects, scientific research and earn a living. And the scientific research should lead to a specific kind of degree that you don't have here in the US, but that we still have in Central Europe. It's called the habilitation degree. And so this diploma puts you on the same level as far as competence is concerned with university professors. And once you have it, you can apply for any position of a full professor that is open at the university. It's still how it works today. Once you have the habilitation, you can apply. I mean, you're not always taken, but you may apply. If you don't have it, you may not even apply, won't even be considered. So the habilitation degree was granted on the basis of a comprehensive scholarly work, in difference to the doctoral dissertation, which covered just one little field, and demonstrated the author's ability to shed light on the phenomena under consideration, but also made significant contributions to present knowledge. Well, okay, so he had to set out and write the book and do the research. Clearly, in such an enterprise required unusual private financial means and unusual energy. There were no university positions for these young scholars. I mean, today we have lots of postdocs, right? Assistant professors and so on. That did not exist in those days, right? There were at the University of Vienna, there were 3 at the time of Mises' writing. There were 3 professors of economics, 3 full professors of economics at the University of Vienna, which was the largest university in the empire. And there were a couple of adjunct professors, okay, unpaid. Everybody else was unpaid, in fact. So it was just 3 paid positions, okay. So no position for young Mises and other young scholars, which would have allowed them to earn a living while they pursued a long-term research project. They were therefore private scholars with only loose university affiliations. They could hope for academic employment only after the successful completion of a habilitation thesis. Meanwhile, they had to survive a prolonged period of professional and material insecurity. If they could not rely on their family or did not wish to do so, they had to earn their living in some other occupation while pursuing scholarship at night. This was science the hard way, and it was Mises' way from March 1906 until December 1911. And we might say, by the way, that he continued science the hard way even after the World War I. In fact, until he found a fully paid position at the university in Geneva in 1934. Until then, he always worked at a daytime job at the Chamber of Commerce and wrote all his books in the evening hours. Okay, so the mother would come, bring him a cup of tea, and the housemaid would come and bring him a sandwich and so on. And then Ludwig sits there and reads hours and hours. And then at 3 o'clock in the night, he switches off the light. And at 9, he's in the office again. Well, Mises took the hard times lightly. We must imagine him as a young man full of energy and enthusiasm for his science. But would he have despaired if he had known that this was how his life would be for almost 30 years? He later admitted that it was hopeless for him to obtain one of the few positions at a German or Austrian university. At one point he observed, sarcastically, quote, "I was ill-suited to teach the Royal Prussian police science," unquote. But even in his youth, he had to realize that he would have to make his way without public support. Austria had produced many geniuses, only to confine them to lives of independent scholarship. There were pioneers like Mendel and Gumplowicz, Mendel, a biologist, Gumplowicz, a sociologist, who had never held university positions. The Austrian government dismissed from teaching Bolzano and Brentano. Who has heard these names? Bolzano? Brentano? Okay, so Bolzano and Brentano were famous philosophers, right? Bolzano at the beginning, as the first half of the 19th century. Brentano was a contemporary of Karl Mengers. So the Austrian government dismissed them from teaching. It isolated Mach, Ernst Mach. Who has heard this name, or Mach? Yeah, well, I have a few hands. So Mach was a famous pioneer of positivistic philosophy. In fact, much better than what has been produced later on by the so-called Vienna Circle. So if you ever come across a copy of one of Mach's books, it's excellent. And the government did not care at all for Husserl, Breuer, and Freud. And nobody has heard of Freud. The government appreciated boehm-bawerk as a capable official, as a civil servant, but not as an economist. However, these failed careers did not deter Mises or thousands of like-minded young men from following their examples. Posterity would honor them, they were sure, just as the present society honored the heroes of the past. Books, monuments, and street names were dedicated to scientists and artists who were ignored in their day. So as the French say, grand mais inconnu, great but unfortunately unknown. So, but still, that's where they got their energy from. The result of their sacrifices was an explosion of creative energies in virtually all fields of human endeavors that made Vienna's glory in the decades before the outbreak of World War I. The intellectual explosion in Vienna was already visible when young Mises prepared for the life of a private scholar, ready to earn his living in some liberal profession. Scholarly pursuits would be his real life, the one that would give significance to all other activities. His professional life would be secondary, a day job to pay the bills. And thus he began on March 15, 1906, a paid internship with the fiscal administration of Lower Austria in its Vienna district headquarters. This was the traditional choice of the sons of civil servant families. It had been the first station in boehm-bawerk's career, and thus it was a promising start for Mises too. A career within the civil service was a highly coveted outlet for law graduates, opening prestigious opportunities within the executive branch of government. The office was then under the direction of Alexander Freiherr von Spitzmüller, who later moved to a top executive position at the Kreditanstalt. It was a big Rothschild creation, and eventually became the last president of the Austro-Hungarian Bank, the Empire Central Bank. Patient and loyal service combined with a dose of clever networking would have put Mises in a position to follow in this great man's footstep and, given his interest in the theory of money and banking, gain a high position within the central bank. Wonderful. But Mises soon discovered that this was a mistake. The paralyzing formal procedures, the mental pittiness, and the personal dependence on one's superiors came to him as a shock. He might have been thinking back on this experience when he wrote on the nature and significance of bureaucracy many years later. So now comes a quote from Bureaucracy 1944. Government jobs offer new opportunity for the display of personal talents and gifts. Regimentation spells the doom for initiative. The young man has no illusions about his future. He knows what is in store for him. He will get a job with one of the innumerable bureaus. He will be a cog in a huge machine, the working of which is more or less mechanical. The routine of a bureaucratic technique will cripple his mind and tie his hands. He will enjoy security, but this security will be rather of the kind that the convict enjoys within the prison walls. He will never be free to make decisions and to shape his own fate. He will forever be a man taken care of by other people. He will never be a real man, relying on his own strength. Oh, that's of course old-fashioned. He shudders at the sight of the huge office buildings in which he will bury himself. Okay, so that was Mises 1944, and certainly that's a reflection of these early experiences. Mises was not going to shudder and bury himself. By the fall of the same year, he asked to be honorably released, and his request was granted. The decision must have caused great consternation among his family and his friends, as we may imagine. How could he give up one of the most covetous positions for young men of his background? How can someone enjoying the privilege of serving His Majesty quit his service voluntarily? It's also a quote. This was, of course, the question was addressed to a friend of Mises who had made exactly the same decision a few years earlier. So then his parents asked, how can someone enjoying the privilege of serving His Majesty quit the service voluntarily? Poor Mises. So we can imagine he had a couple of hard months there at home, especially since his brother was so brilliant. Right? This other guy is becoming one of the youngest professors in Austria-Hungary, and the older brother is, well, on the sidetrack. Mises' choice was indeed remarkable and a vivid testimony to the personality of the young man. Ludwig was not the nice guy who went along with the prevailing notions of a good career. He had his own mind and found the civil service utterly dreadful. He was full of ambition and independent judgment. He had far more confidence in his own abilities than in the protection and prestige accorded to His Majesty's faithful servants. After his resignation, he decided to prepare for a career as a private lawyer. Admission to the bar required that the candidate familiarize himself with the Austrian court system through a 2-year internship at the main courts. From October 1906 to September 1908, Mises interned at the Court for Civil Affairs, the Trade Court, the Penal Court, the Executive Court, and the District Court of the city of Vienna. The atmosphere in these institutions was not much different from what he had experienced in fiscal administration, but at least there was the prospect of leaving the system one day to become his own man. In those years, Ludwig must have been the black sheep of the family. Was he unfit for the real world? Did he not know how to compromise? His brother Richie was the white sheep. He had graduated in the same year as Ludwig, was 2 years younger, graduated in the same year, then moved on as an assistant professor to the University of Brünn, today Brno in Moravia, and in 1909, at the age of 26, he would land a full professorship at the University of Strasbourg. This was a career path that Ludwig would have welcomed, but the real world imposed different choices on him. In the fall of 1908, with the end of his 2-year internship approaching, Mises looked for suitable employment in Vienna, and he was hired by the prestigious law firm of Robert Pelzer and started working in the office in the Krugerstrasse, right in the center of Vienna, in October 1908. Now, the new position was a vast improvement on the still suffocating mental narrowness of courtroom routine, but the firm was not a real escape from the bureaucratic atmosphere of the courts, because they had to deal with them all the time. So it's for those who know Mises' theory of bureaucracy, right? So we know we have another empirical illustration of what he later on described. Mises kept looking for other positions. Now, I see that it's already 5:45. Time is flying by. It's wonderful. I don't have to read all this. So let me make a big jump, and we come to the US, a big jump over the ocean, and then also in time. And now Mises is in the United States. Okay. So in the US, certain things were quite different from what he was used to in Vienna, and positively different. So many of the new people, new friends who came to Mises through his NYU seminar and fee were more libertarian than he was. Here. Suddenly it was Mises who, on several occasions, turned out to represent the more statist position in his seminar. American libertarians such as Leonard Read and R.C. Hoyles placed great emphasis on the definition of political liberty in terms of non-initiation of force. After the publication of Human Action, for example, Hoyles criticized Mises in private correspondence for having admitted that public education can work well. Mises said it could work well in monolingual countries if it is limited to reading, writing, and arithmetic. Hoyles saw this as an unnecessary concession. Public education, even if limited to the case under discussion, was unjustifiable. Now comes a quote from Hoyles. In fact, the fact that some people were compelled to pay who did not want to have children, want to have their children taught, or who had no children, was teaching by example that the majority had a right to coerce the minority to pay for anything the majority wanted. If that is not the worst kind of government intervention, I do not know what intervention means. So now talking to Mises, when you make this one concession, you are denying that our government is limited in what it has a right to do. It seems to me that intervention by the government is just the same thing as initiating force. Understand, I'm not opposed to the use of force to stop someone from initiating force, but the government has no right to initiate force. The only purpose of a government is to stop people from intervening in an unhampered market and to stop people from initiating force to make someone pay for anything he doesn't want to pay for. Now that I can tell you, I never found in Mises' correspondence from the European years. So I never received a letter like this. That was September 1949, 1 week exactly before Human Action appeared. This perspective was entirely outside Mises' utilitarian approach to political problems. He believed that the question of who initiated force was politically irrelevant because one could hardly ever reach agreement on it. The only relevant question was whether the initiation of force was suitable to attain the end of the acting person, even if his action was somehow wrong from an ethical point of view. A 2-sentence letter he sent some 10 years later to an American correspondent, a publisher in Wisconsin, speaks volumes. So says Mises, I read your stimulating letter with great interest. As I see it, the main argument in favor of the capitalist system is that it has raised the standard of living of the common man in an unprecedented way. Another even more substantial point of disagreement between Mises and many American libertarians was the question of democracy. A few months after Fee set up shop, F.A. Harper saw the need to write a 4-page confidential memorandum defending Mises' views on democracy against the criticism of Orville Watts, another Fee employee, who had pitted democracy against American-style liberalism. Mises would also come to taste the particular American flavor of hostility to democracy in a 1947 exchange of letters with Rose Wilder Lane. Apparently they had met for lunch with Hoyles and others, And Lane had the impression that Mises believed they shared the same outlook on fundamentals. At the meeting, she did not feel it was the right time to start a discussion on the subject, but later wrote him to set the record straight. That's what she wrote. As an American, I am, of course, fundamentally opposed to democracy and to anyone advocating or defending democracy, which in theory and practice is the basis of socialism. Full stop. It is precisely democracy which is destroying the American political structure, American law, and the American economy, as Madison said it would, and as Macaulay prophesied that it would do, in fact, in the 20th century. End of quote. Mises did not even bother to address the issue, but observed that he had never addressed people who called his writings stuff and nonsense, as Lane had done in a book review. And that was that for more than 2 years, after which the debate resumed on more civilized terms, probably because of Lane's friendship with Howard Pugh, a big-time Mises sponsor. Mises' basic objection to Lane was that she had misunderstood him. He had never advocated any concrete regime of parliamentary democracy. He merely stressed the fact that all political systems ultimately hinge on mass opinion. Mises' American friends disagreed, and the discussions and correspondence between them remained without conclusion. But the confrontation between the Austrian scholar and his American readers and disciples would be a driving force in the development of libertarian theory. So, here you have it. It's not always important that one agrees, but it's always important to be inspired. Mises' student Murray Rothbard would eventually work out the radical implications of Misesian economics with great care, combining the non-initiation of force criterion that we found in Hoyle's letters, among other things, with the typical Misesian focus on private property rights. Rothbard thus created the blend of libertarian economics and natural law ethics that continues to attract many intellectuals to this day. The new radical environment contrasted sharply with the mentality of Mises' old associates, who had been libertarians by Central European standards, but were moderate interventionists in an American context. A case in point was Fritz Machlup. In a 1946 letter to Mises, he asked his old master to bless his evasive way of addressing pro-labor union audiences. He wrote the following. So comes Machlup. I would like your advice. I must soon give a lecture for the US Chamber of Commerce on monopolistic wage determination as part of the general problem of monopoly. Monopolistic wage determination as a part of the general problem of monopoly. The lecture is to be published and will probably receive more attention than suits my liking. If the lecture were to be presented in a scientific forum, I could go into the history of ideas and in particular Mill and so forth. That is, evade the issue. But for the chamber, I must be practical and political. Horrors. I will have no choice but to say that monopoly wages are the only purpose of labor unions, and that strong labor unions mean unemployment and inflation and lead to an authoritarian state. Can an honest man avoid such statements? Are there any alternatives? If it is politically unthinkable to outlaw labor unions, and I assume this is the case today, can one consider government limitations on private wage increases? I'm not thinking, of course, of a fixing of wages through the state, but of a general interdiction to increase wages. Not in favor of killing him, but just slapping him on the head until he doesn't move anymore. So general interdiction or to increase wages by more than 10% in 3 years or something of the sort. Of course, this is entirely fantastic. Would it be smarter not to mention such makeshift solutions at all? They have no prospect of being accepted. End of quote. Mises replied that he would tell the chamber, quote, first of all, liberate yourself from false ideas. Study economics. Underline. Study economics. Then go on to convince others. And he emphasized, again quote, I reject any outlawing or limitation of the liberty of association. No liberties shall be abolished, only coercion. End of quote. Thank you.